It had been 10 long years since my divorce. 10 years of quiet, measured routines, and a life that had slowly been pared down to the essentials. At 45, I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of my solitude, the predictable ebb and flow of my days. Work, errands, quiet dinners alone, the occasional phone call from a friend, all carefully scheduled, all comfortably uneventful. Yet while the days offered a certain reliability, the nights were something else entirely. Nights brought a stillness that felt heavier than silence itself, pressing down on me like the weight of everything I had left behind. That Tuesday evening began no differently than any other. I had crawled into bed, exhaustion settling into my bones, a thick, unyielding blanket of weariness that seemed impossible to shake. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall, each second echoing in the empty rooms. I closed my eyes, trying to let sleep take me, letting the comfort of my familiar routine cradle me. And then, softly, almost hesitantly, a knock at the door broke the fragile quiet. My heart jumped in my chest, a sudden sharp interruption to the monotony of the night. "Adrian?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. My 25-year-old son stepped into the dim light of my bedroom. There was a shadow on his face, something I couldn't immediately place. "I can't sleep," he murmured, almost too quietly for me to hear. I patted the empty space beside me, and after a brief hesitation, he settled onto the bed. The warmth of his presence was immediate, though it was no longer the warmth of a child curling up beside me. He had grown into a man, his broad shoulders and defined features a stark reminder of the years that had passed. Time had changed him, as it had changed me. He turned slightly to face me, resting his head on my shoulder, and I felt a flutter of emotions I couldn't name. "Sometimes," he whispered, almost inaudibly, "it's just too much." I murmured back, "I'm here," hoping my voice sounded calm, though inside I was a storm of uncertainty and protective instinct. His presence was comforting, yes, but also overwhelming. My mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to answer, questions about how we had grown apart, how we had remained too close, and what it meant to navigate this new phase of life. By morning, Adrian was still asleep beside me, his features relaxed in slumber, but the weight of the previous night lingered in the air like a thick fog. I slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to disturb him, attempting to quiet the whirlwind of thoughts that had taken root in my mind. I moved to the kitchen, where the familiar act of preparing breakfast offered a small comfort. Pancakes, perfectly golden, their aroma filling the kitchen, a reminder of ordinary life, of routines that made the world feel manageable. Adrian entered the kitchen quietly. His gaze lingered on me in a way that felt different, heavier somehow, as though he were searching for something in my expression I couldn't quite understand. Our hands brushed briefly as I handed him his plate, and I sensed a subtle tension, an unspoken weight that had settled between us. Breakfast was eaten in silence, punctuated only by the occasional scrape of a fork against a plate, but the air was thick with something unnameable. I told myself it was nothing, just fatigue, just the lingering shadows of the night. Yet the unease persisted, growing heavier with each passing moment. Evenings became a challenge. Some nights, I would find Adrian lingering in the living room long after I had expected him to retreat to his own space. His presence was quiet but palpable, his eyes reflecting a mix of longing and confusion. I tried to maintain distance, to enforce the boundaries I knew we both needed, but it was difficult. The lines of our relationship, once clear, had blurred over the years, and we were learning to navigate uncharted territory without a map. One night, I woke to find him sitting in the living room, staring out the window at the darkness beyond. The room was filled with shadows, the soft light of a single lamp painting his face in muted tones. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. I nodded silently, sitting beside him, unsure of what words would bridge the distance that had grown between us. "I know things have been complicated," he began, and I could hear the careful restraint in his voice. "I know I've been difficult, but I can't pretend that I don't feel things, that I don't need you." His words were honest, raw, and they hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. "Adrian, we have to be careful," I said softly. "I love you, but you're my son. There are boundaries we can't cross." He nodded, a shadow passing over his expression, but the tension didn't ease. The air between us was charged with unspoken feelings. The weight of reliance, of unfulfilled expectations, of the deep loneliness that we had both carried for so long. I realized then that what we were struggling with was not something simple, not something that could be solved with words alone. It was the accumulation of years, the intertwining of grief, the need for connection in ways that had never been fully acknowledged. Days passed, and we continued to circle around each other, careful, tentative, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Our conversations became loaded with meaning, even when the words themselves were ordinary. A shared cup of coffee, a glance across the kitchen, a fleeting touch on the shoulder. These small interactions carried a weight that neither of us could name. I threw myself into my daily routines more rigorously, trying to fill the void with work, with household tasks, with anything that would keep my mind from dwelling on the emotional labyrinth we were navigating. And yet, no matter how busy I became, the memories of our interactions lingered, pressing at the edges of my consciousness. I hated the way my thoughts drifted back to our conversations, the moments of closeness, the vulnerability he showed. And yet I couldn't stop myself from thinking of them. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, Adrian approached me again. His expression was serious, almost solemn. "I don't know how to say this," he said, "but I need to understand us and what this distance between us means." I looked at him, really looked, and saw a mixture of fear, yearning, and hope in his eyes. "We're both lonely," I admitted quietly. "We've been carrying these feelings for years, but we need to acknowledge them without letting them control us. We need boundaries, Adrian, boundaries to protect ourselves and to protect what's left of us as father and son." He nodded slowly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of clarity between us. Not everything would be fixed overnight, but a path forward had been sketched, faintly, in the shared understanding of our need for connection and for restraint. The tension remained, but it had a name now, a framework that we could work within. The days continued, filled with quiet routines, but there was a new awareness in the air. The unspoken weight had not disappeared, but we learned to navigate it differently, with honesty, with care, with mutual respect. And though the nights still brought their shadows, the mornings offered a little more light. I realized that sometimes the deepest connections are not about closeness in the conventional sense, but about the understanding that even in distance, there can be love, care, and a bond that endures through the complexities of human emotion. And so we moved forward, slowly, cautiously, each day a step toward rebuilding a relationship that had been strained, fractured, and at times incomprehensible. The house was quieter, yes, but the silence was no longer oppressive. It was a space where reflection and growth could happen, where boundaries were respected, and where the love between a parent and child could find new expression, complex, sometimes painful, but undeniably real.